Good morning. Great to see you here. The first day of South by Southwest ECO 2014. I'm Tracy Mann, and I'm the Community Engagement Lead for South by Southwest ECO. And I also have the privilege from time to time of inviting some really great speakers to be here and talk to you on a variety of themes. The speaker that I'm going to introduce this morning, Bob Jensen, is kind of ironically, he's in our own backyard. He's here at the School of Journalism. He's a professor there at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's a board member of the Third Coast Activist Resource Center in Austin. But because I live in New York, I had the ability of, kind of finding out about Bob from afar by reading a lot of the great pieces that he's written for Alternet. You'll also hear about some of the books, or you should know about some of the many books he's read. He'll be signing Arguing for Our Lives, A User's Guide to Constructive Dialogue, and another book that he can tell you the title because I've forgotten it and I don't have it in my notes here. But he'll be signing directly after this talk over in the book signing area, which is in the mezzanine. I think you've passed it on your way in here. I also want to let you know that there will be a question and answer session. We encourage that, and the microphone for your questions is over here. This session is being live streamed, so it's very important that you come up to the mic and make sure you're audible when you voice your questions. What intrigued me about Bob Jensen and why I wanted to invite him here this morning is that he is a contrarian, and he's a very appealing, for me, contrarian. And I think what you're going to hear him talk about this morning will have a very interesting resonance or even perhaps a dissonance with Dr. Bullard's comments earlier this morning about climate justice and how we want to live in the world. As we look at all the exciting startups outside this room, the companies that are here showing new ideas and new products, and we hear scientists talking and we hear politicians talking, some of us also want to make a deep dive into how do we see this world going forward in all aspects, in a holistic aspect. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Bob Jensen, and thank you for being here this morning.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Jensen, and I teach college for a living, so I'd like you all to come down front and turn off your electronic devices. Okay, forget that. You're not my students. I can't threaten to fail you, so you're not going to do what I say. I've also forgotten the title of the other book, even though I wrote it, which tells you something about how long I've been teaching college, perhaps. So I was introduced as a contrarian, so I have to stay true to the introduction. How many of you were at Dr. Bullard's keynote talk this morning? Great. It was really exciting. It's not the first time I've heard him talk, and I always learn something from listening to him. I'd like to make a little bit of a friendly amendment. He said there were 3 terms: urgency, hope, optimism. I'd like to suggest that he had the terms right, but perhaps I'll go a slightly different direction. We are long past the point where urgency is key. There is no rational reason to be optimistic, and therefore it is time to give up on hope. That's my message. Now, it's actually not exactly in opposition to what he said. I think there will be some resonances in what I have to say. But I want to come at these questions from a slightly different angle. So first of all, we're going to talk about not environmental problems today, but ecological crises, emphasis on the plural. So what are my qualifications to talk about this? I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a climate scientist. In fact, I'm not a scientist of any kind. So what would qualify me to talk about the multiple cascading ecological crises of our time? Well, I come out of journalism. The pause, that was my big laugh line. When I say I come out of journalism, you see, then you're all supposed to chuckle. Okay, never mind. We'll move right along. But coming out of journalism when I was younger, I did get good at assembling a few facts, or at least, kind of fact-like statements, and throwing them together in stories that made sense, as long as you didn't linger too long on any one story. Journalism does make sense as long as you move quickly. But the older I got, the more I realized I did want to linger, especially linger on the questions that don't have easy or comfortable answers to them. And eventually I did find a place for myself in academia, which gave me a base not only for engaging in political organizing, community organizing of various kinds, but also gave me a place to sit with those difficult and uncomfortable questions. So now, 23 years after I first came to the University of Texas, about the only thing I'm actually any good at is making people uncomfortable. That's my specialty. And there is time to leave now if the direction of this talk is not what you were hoping. So this ability to deal with discomfort, it started for me in original work I did on the radical feminist critique of pornography and the routine sexual exploitation of women by men in this culture, which, don't worry, I'm not going to take up today if any of you were concerned. From there, I started writing about how even with the accomplishments of the civil rights movement, these very hard to dislodge notions about white supremacy, even among us good white people, still endure and still affect, as Dr. Bullard pointed out, life and death in this country today. I went on and wrote a lot about the barbarism of the U.S. military in various campaigns, allegedly to bring freedom and democracy to the world. And I've been writing a lot lately about the conflict between widely held moral principles that almost all of us do hold and capitalism. In fact, I've been writing about the fundamental incompatibility of capitalism with any moral system that acknowledges the inherent dignity of all people. I've essentially been writing lately that capitalism is a kind of perverse death cult. So as you can see, I choose topics to maximize my popularity with the general public. This is my guiding light. What I actually have been doing in all of this, sort of over and over again from as many angles as I can, is suggest that we're living in a house of cards that is built on shifting sand onto which the chickens will eventually come home to roost, if you don't mind the mixed metaphor. And you don't need to be an architect or an expert in engineering to realize that when enough chickens land on a house of cards that's built on shifting sand, we're going to be straining the already mixed metaphor, but I think you get the point. So I've assigned myself a job here at South by Southwest ECO, which will go against the grain of a lot of the other sessions. And here's what I've assigned myself to do: to state what I think is painfully obvious but too often avoided. In the face of these multiple cascading ecological crises, we are constrained by increasingly dysfunctional public policy that is being crafted by politicians captured by increasingly concentrated wealth, living in an increasingly corrosive culture that undermines our basic humanity with every sort of soul-stifling turn of the wheel in this very digitally enhanced industrial world that we live in. Now, it's not easy to confront the possibility that all of the modern systems and the institutions of those systems that define and structure the world in which we live are either the source of these crises or are profoundly inadequate to help us deal with the crises. So the problem is not just that individuals make mistakes. The problem is not just that individuals sin, that we sometimes fail as individuals, though I do believe that's the case, of course, but that the deeper and the more serious sin is in the systems, and it's collective. And therefore, it can only be dealt with collectively through organizing to change the fundamental systems. Because I believe that, I'm not a conservative, even though my nature is actually to be rather skeptical and cautious, skeptical especially of revolutionary fervor. This is also why I'm not a liberal, even though I like to think of myself as tolerant and open-minded. I would describe my politics as radical because the sin is in the system. And we're going to get to that sin only by going to the root of those systems, which requires that, first of all, we name them honestly. name the system of patriarchy and male dominance, of white supremacy, of imperialism, of industrial capitalism, and the financial system. So I'm a radical, but I don't consider myself a utopian. I don't believe there are alternative systems in which people magically become angels, but there are better systems than the ones we live in, ones that don't bring out the devil in us quite so quickly. I'm not clamoring for some return to a golden age, but I think that we need to recognize that the ingenuity human beings, and we are an ingenious species, the ingenuity that we've applied to creating and maintaining and justifying those systems and their hierarchies now has to be turned to the task of dismantling all of those hierarchies if we're going to create living arrangements that draw on our more cooperative and egalitarian nature, adapted, obviously, to the dramatically different circumstances we live in today and are certainly going to face tomorrow. Now, that's a bit of a contrarian position, and there's a risk in it, of course. Whenever you take up a critical stance, the risk is that you become kind of a professional scold, you know, always wagging your finger and telling people how to live right. I always remember I had a friend who, as I was getting ready to go off on a speaking trip once, I don't think I did that. As I was getting ready to go off on a speaking trip, he said to me, "What group are you going to make feel bad about themselves on this trip?" Which I also laughed at because it was funny, but I think it kind of misses a couple of important points about what I'm trying to do. First of all, it's not really about me making other people feel bad. I think what I do is I explain to people why I feel bad and invite them to join me so that I'm not so lonely. And it's not about feeling bad, but it is, to a large degree, I think, about feeling. Because if we are going to act responsibly, form policies that can eliminate these hierarchies, then we not only have to analyze intellectually, but I do think we have to experience emotionally. Because, of course, the injustices and the suffering that result from hierarchy require that kind of emotional engagement. For me, radical politics is always more than just empathy, but radical politics is impossible without empathy. And so this feeling matters. You know, everybody loves to talk about the need for love, and I'm all for love. That's a perfectly lovely concept. But if we are going to love one another, love others, it requires the capacity for some sort of critical self-reflection about ourselves and the world in which we live. And I think we should recognize that facing this simple claim that the sin is in the systems is not easy, and it's not easy to love through that. I always like to quote Dostoevsky from The Brothers Karamazov, a book I'd like to point out I haven't read the whole thing. You know, dense Russian literature is not my thing, but one of the characters in that book sums this up beautifully, saying, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams." And I think that's a kind of truism that's worth repeating, that life is difficult and painful if we're going to face it honestly. And that if you want to be fully human, that is, if you want to claim your humanity in a meaningful way and do more than just skate on the surface of life, then that demands a confrontation with these kinds of difficult truths. And I think truths like this are always better expressed by artists than by professors. So I'm going to quote my favorite singer-songwriter, Austin's own Eliza Gilkyson. Some of you may know her work. Stunningly talented individual. I'll say more about that later. And in one of her songs, I won't try and sing it. I don't have a voice, but she says, "Those are lost who try to cross through the sorrow fields too easily." And I think we do live in a culture that wants to race through the sorrow fields. And so what this is, a talk that tries to linger a bit in those sorrow fields. We can do that together. Now, we could talk specifically about the sorrows that flow from all those hierarchies within the human family that we've already mentioned. And we should all keep those hierarchies and those sorrows in mind. But for the rest of the time here, I'd like to focus on the sorrows that flow from the human attempt to dominate what we so arrogantly call nature, a term that's often used in ways that suggest somehow we are set off from nature rather than simply being one of many species in a single living world. I often think of the insanity when people will say something like, I'm going to get out of the city this weekend and go spend some time in nature, as if you can identify this place, nature, and designate it. And of course, there are consequences of that belief that we have the right to trash some parts of the planet for our own gratification as long as we designate some others relatively pristine. It reflects this illusory belief we have that it's possible to establish a hierarchy with humans on top and all other living things below. In its most extreme form, a hierarchy in which humans believe that we can actually set the terms for the creation and destruction of life. And just as hierarchies within the human family will always lead the powerful to view the powerless as expendable, so does the claim of humans to dominate nature lead us to view some parts of the planet as expendable. Again, reaching to poets, Wendell Berry, I'm sure many of you, how many of you know the work of Wendell Berry? Okay. Those who didn't raise your hand, you have your assignment for after the talk. Wendell Berry captured this, I think, this feeling better than anyone in 3 lines of a poem. It's a poem that's really haunted me ever since I read it. And Wendell says, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. The world is one. So what I want to do for our time together is go even deeper, maybe even beyond the sorrow, to a kind of anguish that I feel, and I know others do, when we honestly confront what the human family has done, still does every day, and is going to keep right on doing to destroy creation. Now, I use the term creation not to make any theological claim, but rather because I think it's a term that conveys reverence. Whether anyone believes or doesn't believe in a creator, and for the record, I don't, I think we can all agree on one thing, that if there were a creator, we are not it. So don't worry if you thought I was going to veer off into religious fundamentalism. Don't worry. Instead, I want to talk about another kind of fundamentalism that in some ways is far more dangerous, what many are starting to call technological fundamentalism. The belief, the fundamentalist belief, that whatever problems we face in these ecological arenas, we can solve by more high energy, high technology. Curiously, the belief that we can even solve the problems created by previous generations of high energy, high technology with more high energy, high technology. That's technological fundamentalism. And I think the technological fundamentalism at loose in the world today kind of embraces this godlike pretension that some humans have. You can see it in the title of a book, by a recent book by a so-called environmentalist called The God Species, Saving the Planet in the Age of Humans. Somewhat arrogant title. Some of you are old enough to remember in 1968 when Stuart Brand published the Whole Earth Catalog. It began with this very famous line, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." Brand wrote another book 4 decades later as the evidence of human failure had piled up year after year. But it didn't cause Brand to rethink the fundamentalism. in that book, he said, we are as gods and have to get good at it. So since these guys brought up God, I didn't bring God into this myself, I'm going to stay secular on you. But since they brought up God, I do think there are some theological terms that are useful in trying to get a handle on these questions. Specifically, the notion of the apocalypse. Now, I already told you I'm not a fundamentalist. If you're worried that I'm going to launch into some rapture-ready talk about lakes of fire and rivers of blood and all that, don't worry. I'm not going to do that. I'm not here to rescue any of you from damnation at the end of days. Although I'm just scanning. Some of you probably could use that, but it's not my test. Whoa. What I want to do is rescue the term apocalypse and see what help it might offer us in understanding the world we live in today. First thing is definitional. The word apocalypse is from the Greek, as the word revelation is from the Latin, and they both mean the same thing. The word apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. The word apocalypse and revelation both mean a lifting of the veil that had clouded sight, a coming to clarity, an understanding, a deeper understanding. So I want to talk a bit about the apocalyptic tradition in very non-theological terms, but first I want to outline the two other dominant traditions that come out of theology, what we could call the royal tradition and the prophetic tradition. So one of my favorite theologians, Walter Brueggemann, he talks about this royal tradition, a royal consciousness, he says, going back to ancient Israel, when Israel had sunk into disarray. The world of Solomon had overturned the world of Moses. It was an affluent society, very oppressive, and religion had calcified, replacing a god of liberation with basically a god of empire. Right? The danger of this royal consciousness that Brueggemann identifies increases when it spreads not only from the upper elite, but throughout the privileged sectors, and even flows down to a wider public, which then accepts royal power. And Brueggemann says this creates a false consciousness. He says, quote, "The royal consciousness leads people to numbness, especially to numbness about death." And Brueggemann describes such a culture as one that is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. And there are prophets of the royal consciousness, the high priests, perhaps, I think, the quintessential prophet of the royal consciousness today is probably Bill Gates, somebody like that. False prophets, I would argue, but offered that status. Now, there's always been a prophetic challenge to this royal consciousness and to royal power. And the prophetic tradition asks people to reconnect to the best of the history and to renew a covenant with each other and with the larger living world. I think Dr. Bullard today was speaking in that prophetic tradition. And it's important to recognize that in that tradition, one needs no special status. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have specific training to speak prophetically, right? To speak from the heart about that kind of truth. The prophetic tradition just requires that you have the courage to confront the abuses of the powerful and to acknowledge our own complicity. The prophetic tradition doesn't just call out the powerful. It asks how we are all part of unjust and unsustainable systems. And that requires what Karl Marx is not from the biblical tradition, the different scripture there. It's what Karl Marx called cultivating a ruthless criticism, not only of others, but of self. So the prophets in this tradition did call out corrupt leaders, but they also asked society to reflect on its own complicity. And this is what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, again, folks who are older in the room will remember him not just as a theologian and a rabbi, but as a political activist in the movements of the 60s. And he wrote a very well-known study of the prophets from the Hebrew Bible. And he said, above all, the prophets remind us of the moral state of a people. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. Heschel says, if we admit that the individual is in some measure conditioned or affected by the spirit of society, an individual's crime discloses society's corruption. In other words, what he's suggesting is that the prophets understood that the sin is in the system. Now, if you speak in this prophetic voice, if you invoke the prophetic, as I think Dr. Bullard was doing this morning, it doesn't promise quick change. It doesn't promise a carefree future. The prophetic tradition doesn't say everything's going to be easy once we get on the right path. But I think the prophetic tradition implies that the disastrous course that a society may be on can be corrected, or at least can be corrected in time. And the question I want to ask is, what happens if the basis for that claim evaporates? When prophetic warnings have not been heeded for generation after generation, what comes next? I think that's when this notion of an apocalyptic sensibility is very helpful. Again, invoking the apocalyptic tradition doesn't predict the end of the world. It just recognizes that the end of an era is in fact coming. So it's not really about rapture and being lifted up. It's about recognizing the rupture that is severe enough to change the nature of the whole game. All right. So again, what I'm suggesting is the prophetic imagination helps us analyze and strategize about the historical moment that we're in, but it's based on a faith that the systems can be reshaped to avoid the worst consequences of this royal consciousness, to shake off that numbness about death, to achieve some sort of ecological sustainability with some acceptable level of social justice. But when it's no longer possible, I think it's time that we start thinking about what's on the other side. And let me just say again, I am not suggesting that I can or anyone can predict the future. So this is where I don't think the message from Dr. Bullard's talk is mutually exclusive with what I want to talk about. One can sort of act prophetically and think prophetically at the same time that one is pondering the apocalyptic, that we can find ways, explore new ways to bring the existing systems into closer alignment with our own values on sustainability and justice, and yet still think about the social arrangements we're going to need for living under dramatically different conditions. And that's hard in this culture, which has a kind of, sunny side up optimism. Everybody's got to be upbeat all the time in America. And it doesn't really matter what the facts are. You have to remain upbeat no matter what. But here I want to borrow from another of my favorite writers, James Baldwin, who said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And that reckoning is important. That line comes from an essay he wrote in the early 60s called "As Much Truth as One Can Bear." And he was writing in that essay about the struggle of artists, especially writers, novelists like him, to help a society, in that case white supremacist America, really face the depth of its own pathology. And Baldwin suggested that a great writer, a writer who really pushes, is going to attempt to, quote, tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. And I think that's a prophetic call, to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. The apocalyptic invocation, I think, would be slightly different. It would be to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more, and then all of the rest of the truth, whether you can bear it or not. And if it does feel like too much to bear, I think that's because it is too much to bear. Yet I don't see any choice but to bear it. And I think the earlier we face up to that, the more time we have to make thoughtful choices. And I think that's another aspect of the apocalyptic tradition. It reminds us that the absence of hope for these systems does not have to leave us without purpose, that life is always at the same time about death and then rejuvenation. So if the evidence of the failure in this phase, the failure of these systems, is final, and all the hope is gone for these systems, can we retain our ability to imagine something beyond the failure? That is to say, if the Anthropocene, this term for the current epoch in the history of the planet, if the Anthropocene is winding down, it does not mean there will be no human presence in a new epoch. It just means it will be a new epoch, and it will be rules written not by us, as we imagine we have been writing the rules, but rules set by this nature that we thought we had control over. Now, I'm going to pause here. I've been speaking as if everyone agrees with me on this assessment of the health of the ecosphere and the nature of contemporary social, political, and economic systems. Based on the expression on some faces, I'm guessing you don't all agree with my assessment of the health of the ecosphere and these systems. So I want to ask a series of questions that can at least help us sharpen the potential points of disagreement. The first set of questions, these are, by the way, rhetorical questions. I don't want to hear from you right now. Just process these. I teach college, remember. We often ask questions pretending to want the feedback of students. We don't, really. We just want you to sit there and listen. These questions about the health of the ecosphere. How would you describe, to someone who hadn't been thinking much about this, how would you describe the current health of the ecosphere in terms of soil, especially thinking about soil erosion and soil fertility? How would you explain to people how to look at the fact that we lose, because of modern agricultural practices, around 23 billion tons of topsoil every year in the world, which is roughly 1% of the topsoil available to us? How would you describe the current health of the ecosphere in terms of water, thinking both about freshwater supplies and quality, as well as the health of the oceans, especially the acidification of the oceans? How would you describe the current health of the ecosphere in terms of biodiversity, thinking here specifically about species extinction rates, which are thousands of times greater than what scientists call the background rate, what would be the natural species extinction rate? How would you describe the current health of the ecosphere in terms of the effects of the extraction processes, thinking especially about the risks and costs of various kinds of mining and drilling endeavors that are now commonplace? Endeavors such as hydraulic fracturing, mountaintop removal for coal, deep water drilling in the oceans, and perhaps most profoundly, the tar sands of Canada. How would you describe, to finish up this list of questions, how would you describe the current health of the ecosphere in terms of climate, thinking about global warming and the rapid destabilization of the global climate patterns and all that comes with that? Those seem like questions worth pondering. Now, next set of questions about human systems. Does anyone think that the response of the general public and policymakers to date is commensurate with the nature of the threats? Thinking here of the threat to the long-term viability of the ecosphere's capacity to sustain large-scale human populations. Is the response to date what is needed? Does anyone think that the existing social and cultural systems, that is, the way we organize and understand daily life, are adequate to move us toward the response we need? Does anyone think the existing political system, the way we make public policy, is equipped to take us toward those decisions? Does anyone think the existing economic system, the way we produce, distribute goods and services and the wealth distribution that flows from that, is that adequate to move us toward the responses we need? And does anyone think the existing intellectual institutions, using that term generously, things like schools, universities, churches, mass media, does anyone think they're equipped to help us understand the nature of this predicament? So if we step back and think about the health of the ecosphere, of the larger living world on which our own lives depend, and think about the systems that currently define and structure virtually all of human societies, where does that leave us? Well, when I try and make this point, people often come back very quickly and say, but we can't give up. And let me be clear, I agree, we can't give up. I'm not arguing that anybody should give up. I don't give up in my own life. I continue to work on a variety of projects. So this is not an argument for passivity or paralysis. But if indeed the health of the ecosphere is near several tipping points, science has identified, and probably past several other tipping points, and if the human systems are not equipped to deal with that level of trouble, shouldn't we face that reality directly so that at least we can be clear about the choices we have? So the question isn't, should we keep working at the problems? The answer is obviously yes. The struggle is to understand better the nature and the causes of the problems so that we can at least work on the most sensible potential solutions. And here I think we have to start by recognizing that there are problems without solutions. There are problems without solutions if by solutions we mean solutions that can keep the current state of affairs operating indefinitely without dramatic shifts to the way we understand ourselves and interact with the world. There are problems, in fact, in that sense, without solutions. It seems to me that the readily available data and a reasonable analysis of that data would suggest that the ecological realities and the likely trajectory of the social, political, economic systems means that a large-scale human presence on the planet in anything like the current ways we organize our lives is highly unlikely. Now, this is not some doomer scenario. I'm not going to start suggesting you stock up on dried food and shotgun shells. I think it's simply an honest assessment of the future that we should be preparing to face. Now, this is the point, and with all due respect to Dr. Bullard, this is the point where speakers usually say something like, we must have hope. And I used to say things like that myself until a very good friend of mine named Jim Copland told me finally that he was tired of what he called my hope mongering. He said it was time to go peddle hope somewhere else. He wasn't listening anymore. Which makes me pause and sort of fess up that this whole talk has been building up to what essentially is nothing but a promo for my next book, which is going to deal with the life and the ideas of Jim Copland. And one of the most important ideas, what he taught me, was that hope is for the morally weak and the intellectually lazy. And since I know that no one in this room is morally weak or intellectually lazy, the morally weak and intellectually lazy people, they're in the other sessions, right? This is the cream of the crop right here. So I think you might enjoy hearing a bit more about my friend Jim. So if you don't recognize the name Jim Copland, don't worry. He's not famous. There's no reason you should recognize him unless you knew him. He was a really wonderful writer, but most of his writing went into incredibly powerful letters that he wrote to friends. He wrote almost nothing for public consumption. In his activist work, he was almost always behind the scenes, which he preferred to mouthing off in public. If there was ever a chance the spotlight was going to fall on him, he would step out of the way and gently nudge someone else into it. So I met Copland in 1988 when I landed back in graduate school. And from that first meeting until he died in 2012 at the age of 79, he really was sort of my intellectual guide. And it's virtually impossible for me to untangle anything I have thought over the past 26 years from the thoughts and conversations I had with Jim. In fact, at the memorial service for him, I made a joke that his friends understood, that I had spent the last, at that time, 24 years as Jim Copland's ventriloquist dummy. Right? He would think things, and then I would open my mouth and the words would come out. But a lot of those words were, in fact, directly from Jim. And I was very lucky when I landed in graduate school, because my real education wasn't in the classroom, it was with him. Originally in that feminist work, he helped me understand how men can be allies in feminist movements. He helped me understand how white people can be constructive critics of white society. He helped me understand why it mattered to continue opposing U.S. wars. He helped me understand how to talk critically about capitalism without sounding like some caricatured lefty. And probably most important, he introduced me to a number of really wonderful writers on ecology and agriculture, people like Wendell Berry, Wes Jackson, and others that fill up my bookshelf today. But I don't want you to think there was anything particularly out of the ordinary about Jim. He was just your run-of-the-mill, typical, average central Minnesota farm boy who was gay, who got a PhD in experimental psychology, and then developed anarchist-influenced radical feminist and anti-imperialist politics, and managed in the second half of the 20th century to get involved in every important left progressive movement while never losing touch with his rural roots. You meet guys like that all the time, yeah? I mean, you walk around Austin, all sorts of folks like that. And probably the most important thing about Jim was that throughout his whole life, and almost literally to his dying breath, he spent some part of every day on what he considered to be his most important work, which was tending the garden. In trying to explain Jim to people who don't know him, I've taken to calling him a plain radical. And I mean plain in the sense of unadorned, not fancy. He wasn't concerned with cultural fashions or intellectual fads. But plain also in the sense that Aldo Leopold meant when, in his classic book, A Sand County Almanac, he noted that adopting a land ethic, quote, changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. So the lessons I learned from Jim Copland could fill a book, as they say, which is exactly why I am finishing up a book on him. Today, I just want to leave you with two statements Jim made very early in my acquaintance with him, going back more than 2 decades now. 2 decades ago, long before people were talking about these multiple cascading ecological crises in the way that you'll hear them talked about, the first thing Jim said was, I wake up every morning in a state of profound grief. And I think he meant that quite literally. Jim was not a depressed person. He wasn't a depressing person to be around, but he grieved for the state of the world probably more deeply than anyone I've ever known personally. He spent a lot of time in the sorrow fields. The other thing Jim said is the last the last task of the human species is to learn to leave the planet gracefully. And I think he meant that too. He was not making predictions about what was going to happen in some specific time frame, but he did conclude that everything he could see suggested that we had passed a point of no return, and that the ecological realities we've been discussing, combined with these bad habits that human beings have trouble giving up, meant the task was not to hold on to the Anthropocene, not to hold on to the systems we live in, but to start to prepare for the next epoch with as much grace as possible. And he really built his life on that idea, taking very seriously these terms that now get used kind of glibly: social justice, ecological sustainability. They weren't cliches for Jim. They were the principles on which he built his life and how he made decisions about how to spend his time and his money. And he did contribute to a lot of different kinds of projects. Most recently, he lived in Minneapolis. He worked with the Land Stewardship Project, which, if you're not familiar with, is a great organization working toward sustainable agriculture and the public policy necessary to make it possible. He consistently nurtured younger people, scholars, activists, artists. He was a very trustworthy member of his communities, both the human community and the larger biotic communities. As long as you weren't a squirrel coming after his produce, you were in good hands with Jim. So he didn't back away from this harsh and dreadful future, but he also didn't allow that to paralyze him. He didn't use it as an excuse to avoid the work of the world. And in fact, he engaged in it, as I said, up till his last days. He loved a Marge Piercy poem that was called "To Be of Use." And the lines I always think of from that poem when I think of Jim: "The pitcher cries out for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." And that's, in a way, what I think I'm trying to get at is, how do we ask ourselves and answer the question, is the work we are doing real? Does it matter? And I wanted to use an example. Last weekend, I was at the Land Institute's annual Prairie Festival gathering in Salina, Kansas. If you're not familiar with the Land Institute, another important organization, probably the leading research institution developing new methods in sustainable agriculture. And the president of the institute, Wes Jackson, and the scientists there are working on what they call natural systems agriculture. The question is, can we replace the petrochemical-dependent industrial agriculture of the modern era with a more sustainable agriculture that tries to mimic natural ecosystems, that takes, as he says, nature as measure? And at the heart of this work, it gets complicated, and I'm not an agronomist, but at the heart of the work is what they call perennial polycultures. Right now, most of the food of the world is grown as annuals in a monoculture, big fields of corn or soybeans, one crop. And of course, as annuals, they need to be replanted every year, which creates these problems of soil erosion. The question that Wes and the scientists at the Land are asking is, can we grow food in mixtures, polycultures, and cultivate perennials, plants that don't need to be replanted every year? Can we deal with these problems of soil erosion while controlling weeds, pests, and pathogens without massive amounts of fossil fuel inputs? And they're working on that at the Land. And so let's ask the question, is the work of the Land Institute real? Is it worth doing? And I think, in fact, it is. That doesn't mean you have to have some fantastical notion that perennial polycultures are going to take us to the New Jerusalem, that everything's going to be fine, or that any other single innovative idea, or in fact any combination of innovative ideas, will magically change that harsh and dreadful reality. But I think the work of the Land Institute is real in the way that it might help us create a soft landing on the other side. One way to say this is, in industrial agriculture, you hear often that the task is what? To feed a world of 7 billion, to feed a world of 8, 9 billion. And if the Land Institute's research goes forward, it can help that. But it also, I think, is even more important to ask the question that's more likely, which is not how are we going to feed a world of 9 billion? How are we going to feed a world of 1, maybe 2 billion? How are we going to feed the world that we're actually heading toward, which is not going to be a world of 9 billion indefinitely? Whatever we're doing, I think those are the kinds of questions we have to be able to ask. In other words, to give up on this notion that the God species is going to save this world and start talking about what a saving remnant for the new world is going to look like. Now, I think, as my friend Jim thought, that you can tell the truth about the fallen world in which we live and even confront that truth about how far it has left to fall without giving up. The resolve to continue working on meaningful projects doesn't require a guarantee of eventual success. In fact, I would argue that that work has to go forward even with a acceptance of the inevitable failure. Because no matter what's ahead of us, life is going to continue, and the quality of that lives matters, and it depends on what we do here and now. That whatever else we imagine, there is always the work of a saving remnant. Now, in recent years, I've become more and more frustrated with the political organizers who like to whip up a crowd with some version of, if we all just put our heads together, put our shoulders to the wheel, if we all just chip in, we can beat this, we can win. You hear that a lot. And I'm tired of that. And I'm tired of the organizers who say it. Partly because I think it's untrue, and partly because I think they know it's untrue as well, and yet still say it, perhaps because they don't know what else to say. But I'm also afraid of that because I think it's counterproductive. Increasingly, people who look at the reality of the world don't buy that kind of optimism. And if they do buy it, and then it turns out that the promises aren't deliverable, I think people tend to get even more disenchanted and become less engaged and active. So telling the truth is, I think, worthwhile not only on principle, that it's good to tell the truth, but that in the long run, it's a more effective strategy as well. Now, if you agree with some of this analysis and you still find yourself saying, we have to have hope, I'm going to end with some additional lines from another Wendell Berry poem, one of his Sabbath poems. I've learned a long time ago that when you're talking to folks in an ecological space, it's good to quote Wendell Berry, because people like Wendell Berry, and if you associate yourself with an author that people like, it at least gives you enough time to get to the door before people decide that, it confuses people. They say, he was a real asshole, but he quoted Wendell. And by the time they figure it out, you can at least find your way to the exit. And in doing this, I don't want to pretend to know what Wendell Berry meant by these lines. Right? I think if you ask Wendell, he would probably say the point of poetry is not to tell people what it means, but to open up space for people to experience, interpret on their own. So I'm going to conclude with these lines from Wendell Berry's Sabbath 2007 poem, his reflections on hope. Wendell writes, "It is hard to have hope. It's harder as you grow old, for hope must not depend on feeling good. And there is the dream of loneliness at absolute midnight. You also have withdrawn belief in the present reality of the future, which surely will surprise us. And hope is harder when it cannot come by prediction any more than by wishing. But stop dithering. The young ask the old to hope. What will you tell them? Tell them, at least, what you say to yourself." So, with that ending that was every bit as upbeat as my beginning, we do have a little bit of time. Questions, comments, challenges, reflections. This isn't the kind of talk that lends itself to specific questions, perhaps, but a chance to reflect on your own thoughts, your own experiences with grappling with all of this. So there is a microphone. They would like you to speak into the mic. Anyone who would like to comment or ask a question? Yes?
Good afternoon.
I think
Good
you
morning.
might want to lift that up a little bit. you need to bend down. One of the two, whichever is easier.
Of a roadie. Inspiring. I expected you were going to start talking about William Albrecht, maybe even in some of your comments, although I don't know if he has any good quotes. My own thinking on minerals and soil and our role in society leads me to believe that we're asking for the industrial apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And that is what our big industry, big politics, big government, big media fears more. And it becomes at that point that I say, how do we as individuals have hope? And when I talk about this with fellows here in the local church group or something, it's sort of like we feel like it's so far beyond us. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question is, does it just have to run its course? Is it that far beyond, out of our control? It just has to run its course, and we just have to be ready there to land softly ourselves.
So you're identifying that there's this industrial mindset that defines the current world, and that it's inconsistent with a sustainable future, right? And just to point out how true that is, some of you, there's been a lot of writing about this the last decade or so, but the existing population of the world at 7 billion is possible mostly because of one industrial process called the Haber-Bosch process. It was invented in the early 20th century. It was when chemists finally figured out how to take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it in a way that created fertilizer. It's an energy-intensive process. It's feasible mostly because of cheap natural gas. Vaclav Smil, who's an excellent ecologist in Canada, estimated that probably around 45% of the current human population is a direct result of the Haber-Bosch process, of the ability to synthesize nitrogen fertilizers at that level in an industrial process that's based on cheap energy. When that's gone, the world shifts dramatically. 3 billion people on this planet wouldn't be alive without one industrial process. We're talking about the transition out of the industrial mind, the industrial worldview, which means not only, how we produce clothing, but literally how we structure the world. How do you start to get a handle on that? I don't know. I think it's all we can do to recognize that that is the transition we're going to go through. And even if we can't, radically change that, how we go through that transition depends on us. Right? And how we understand what it means to be human, what it means to be human in relationship to others, we understand what it means to be a citizen of the United States in relationship to the world. All of this demands attention, not because we're going to magically save the industrial world, but because the transition out of the industrial world is going to depend on that. That's what I would say, for which there's no guarantees and no clear, strategy, except to hang on to whatever makes us human. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patrick Leacham with Decision Strategies. We're a consulting firm in Houston, and I have to say I can relate to an awful lot of what you're talking about. I've written some things, and there's a talk that I give called "Everything We Know Is Wrong," mm-hmm. which I've given in a couple of different forms. Although you've made me realize that I'm kind of an amateur at these things. One encouraging thing, I guess I would say, is I've given that talk in some forums where you would not expect a very welcome reception, including at the American Association of Petroleum Geologists once. And it was remarkably well received by an awful lot of people. Now, my guess is there were probably an awful lot of people who didn't come up to talk to me afterwards who thought it was a lot of nonsense. But the brunt of it is just that as you say, the systems and our way of thinking about all this stuff, which has been remarkably successful at improving the human condition, only worked because we were in certain circumstances, and those circumstances have changed, and we're kind of in the proverbial Jared Diamond situation of we can choose to change our behaviors or we can watch things collapse. And then in reading Elizabeth Kolbert's book, right, The Sixth Extinction, the realization that I had is that a lot of these things that we're doing are who we are, right? It's what makes us human to change things and travel and go from place to place. And there are all of these second order effects that happen as a result of that, which we can't anticipate because we're dealing with complex nonlinear systems. And now we're kind of catching a glimmer of what the results are. So it's, as I say, I'm a bit hopeful in the sense that I think a lot more people out there than perhaps we realize have caught a glimmer of this and realize this. The more then the pessimism comes in, or the realization comes in that there are a couple of forces we're up against as well. One is that human beings think 100 years is a long time, and it's not. And what we've been doing has worked for several hundred years, so a lot of people just dismiss it out of hand. And the other is that it's really difficult to get anywhere with people if part of your message has even an unspoken undercurrent that the way they live their lives is somehow wrong.
Yeah. There's 8 points I'd like to make in response, but recognizing the time and wanting to hear from the last person, I'm just going to invite you to close us off, perhaps, which means there's a lot of weight on you to be really insightful, since I failed on that topic. So.
My question is, I think, related to the first guy's question, which is, for an individual, does it matter what we do? If there's sort of this inevitability, but if it does matter, what do you suggest?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like saying, does it matter if I'm kind to my neighbors, or, yeah, everything matters. The only thing I can say is that, to some degree, how we respond to this is about how we want to be human. And I always say, and I'll end on this, is I'm a tenured full professor at a major American research university. For those who know the academic system, that means I can basically come to work drunk the next 6 years and not be fired. I could sit at home and watch cable TV all day, and they wouldn't even notice I'm gone. Okay, so I am one of the most privileged people on the planet in terms of my material situation. And I continue to put a fair amount of my own time and energy into various kinds of organizing projects that I believe will fail if the measure of success and failure is changing the existing system. Why would I do that? It's because that's how I hold on to some sense of my own humanity as I want to be, flawed and failed as it might be. So to me, that's the first question is, how do we become the people we want to be? And the only way I know to do that is to struggle, even when the struggle doesn't guarantee success, or in fact is a struggle that you accept in the big picture has failed. But the quality of our lives from day to day is impacted by all of this. And the state of the planet that future generations have to struggle with is affected. So even if the trajectory is down, there's still a trajectory that we can affect, and what we do matters. And individual people will find different ways to do that. Everybody has different talents and temperament, and what makes sense to me may not make sense to you. But I think as long as people are in the fight, as long as people are committed, let 100 flowers bloom and we'll see what happens. I don't find that hard. I don't have any answers for anybody else. I most days don't have very clear answers for myself. But that's basically the human predicament. So with that, thanking all the folks from South by Southwest ECO who solicited me to come and deliver this upbeat talk, brothers and sisters. And I'm going to go outside, and they have some books. If you want to talk more, I'd be happy to chat more. Thank you.